Hi, everyone. Awesome. Good break. You got to watch me totally crash and burn on trying to do a 3-column layout the old school way. We sort of got part of the way there, but we didn't. And then in a minute, I'm going to show how to do this with Bootstrap. And let me talk quickly about what Bootstrap is. Bootstrap is, they don't call it a framework. I guess they call it a toolkit, and that's about right. It was created by Twitter. It's been around at least 10 years. I want to say more than 15. So it's a great example of a technology that is mature and reliable and like well supported. It's not going anywhere. And it's a great choice of something to use. And what it is it's a whole bunch of CSS classes designed to work together, along with, especially for some of the more like interactive things that it offers, like JavaScript as well, all kind of bundled together, because we'll see this more tomorrow, but we can write JavaScript and load it in the browser and have JavaScript do certain things to like HTML elements based on their CSS class. And the term that you'll see a lot is components. Like here's a great example of the term is like a carousel. And if I click on this, well, it's a little harder to see what's going on under the hood than I was hoping. But like whenever you see stuff animating or moving, there's probably some JavaScript going on. And we're going to see this term components with React as well. And it's stuff that we can plug in and use. And Bootstrap has a ton of great components. And then what they have that's really great is this grid system. And so we'll look at that in a sec. And I'm just going to very quickly take us through sort of like the journey from the era of this to Bootstrap. So assuming I had remembered and figured out how to get a 3-column layout working with this, as you folks can tell, there's already a lot of moving pieces here, like position and float do powerful but initially counterintuitive things, and everything kind of interacts with each other, especially like as our content gets bigger. And so even if we get this working, it's not the best way. And so very early on, people started trying to figure out ways to simplify this process. And one of the problems we have with this as well is, you know, back when when there were no smartphones, we didn't have to think about screen resolution or viewport resolution, as you pointed out, Jim, is the more accurate term to describe it. But you know, now we do, and that's where, and I'm kind of diving back to briefly to some of the curriculum stuff. We sort of saw these meta tags the other day. And let's see if this does what I want it to. So, Jim, I guess I have to eat my words a little bit, because you were asking, like, does the term container, like when you see it in a string and one of these attributes have a special value? And I was like, well, like element attribute values don't have special values, but that's not totally true. Like with the meta tag, like, you know, I can put whatever string I want in here, but the browser isn't going to know what to do with that. So there are some special terms. And if this works, and it might require a page refresh and doing this again. I think you have
some typos, like a initial, if that's supposed to be, is missing an I.
Oh yeah, thank you. That is the other problem with all this stuff, is that we don't get our editor helping us. And to be honest, I'm not 100% sure how much we get here from this in terms of font size and stuff. I want to say that's a bit better than what we saw before. And in fact, if we comment this out, if I force a page refresh, and then you often have to, yeah. So with this meta tag commented out, when the browser is simulating an iPhone, something with a smaller screen, with smaller resolution, less pixels on the screen, this stuff is tiny and impossible to read. With this, we're telling the browser, hey, look at the viewport, the screen that the browser is, the screen of the physical device the browser is showing in. Make the content of this web page be relative to the width of the device. And I don't know exactly what's going on there under the hood, but the outcome is really clear, where this gets a bit bigger and more readable because the browser is now paying attention to the size of the viewport or the actual physical screen that the browser's in. So that's kind of like a quick introduction to the issue of responsive web design, which is designing web pages and web apps that will look good across different kinds of devices and multiple screen sizes. And there's this term responsive, which we have here in DevTools, the idea being like, hey, I should be able to shrink and grow the browser window dynamically and sort of however I want. And the website should not look terrible. That's the basic concept. We saw we can use like percentage as a value for width and height. You can use it for all sorts of things. There are some other units that are relative. There is also something that's really powerful called media queries. And I'm going to very quickly throw in some of these. And this is where CSS starts to get a bit more complicated. And again, I'm kind of borrowing this from our lesson from today. And what we're doing here, and we'll do that. Media here refers to, like, essentially, again, the screen, like the physical device, like what media is this website being displayed in? And what we're saying is, for anything where the screen is less than 1,245 pixels, for this HTML element for the whole document, and I don't have to do this, it could be like this. And this is one of the few cases where we see nested CSS rules, which I do remember someone asking about. Set the font size to be 18 pixels. If the screen gets smaller, let's make the font size smaller because we don't have as much room. And let's see if this works. And let me go ahead and change this back to HTML so it applies to the whole document. And let me make this a bit more dramatic. And let's change this maybe to like 600 pixels, and we'll make it, oh, and I missed the PX here. Let's try 8px. And now at some point, my font size should get a lot smaller. Though I will say this doesn't seem to be working.
Do you have to call media in the HTML, or you can keep it to CSS file only?
It should just be the CSS file. It should be based on the width, and then the browser should be applying the style rule. We can take a quick look here. Yeah.
Do you need to specify the unit for like the width or for any measurement? Because you didn't specify like if it was you just said 600 on 51.
Oh, thank you. That that could have broken it silently, yes. Let's see. And I may not even be getting to the max size. I'm sort of going by the pixel numbers in this upper right corner as I shrink and grow. So let's try like 500 and 800 just to see if we can like see a change happen.
Can we just take the periods off in 45 and 52? Because it looks like that we would be trying to apply a class.
Oh, thank you. That is totally the problem. I was moving way too fast. Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to apply it to everything in the HTML element. Now we're cooking. Thank you guys so much. So yeah, and so this is the term for this is like a breakpoint. And like when we're beyond 800 pixels, this rule isn't applying, like as when we're out here. When I shrink it and I hit the breakpoint, the rule applies. So it applies up to this max width value. And you can also set like a min width value too. Like if we wanted to do min width of 800 pixels, color blue, let's make it 50. So now from when the screen size is 800, a minimum of 800 pixels or bigger, the font size is 50 pixels and the font color is blue. And let's see if this works. And there we go. It got a little bigger, but more so it got blue. So because we saw the way that like if the content gets too big, it can screw up layout stuff. Using breakpoints is really powerful. You, especially working with Bootstrap, will not need to manually set your own breakpoints, but that is what Bootstrap is doing. And we can look at Bootstrap's CSS. In fact, let's see if we can find the GitHub repo. So TWBS stands for, it's got to be Twitter Bootstrap. So this is the GitHub repository that holds Bootstrap. And if we poke around in here, there's going to be a lot of stuff going on, but we can find the actual CSS for all these things. And I don't know, it gets pretty complicated. Like SCSS actually is sort of an addition to CSS that lets you include variables. So again, the design and building of this gets pretty complicated, but the main thing here is that there's a lot of CSS that they've written. You can import CSS files from one to another. It's pretty amazing because it's done a huge amount of work for us and it's saving us a ton of work. But at the end of the day, it's still all HTML and CSS and JavaScript. The other two technologies that have really revolutionized and made website design and layout dramatically simpler is a CSS feature called Flexbox. And if we go to this site called Can I Use, that tells us support for language features. These days, it's available for everything. That didn't used to be the case. I wish it showed the year that this was released, which we could find out if we wanted to Google, but it's not critical. And just Flexbox and CSS Grid are sort of each worthy of their own tutorial. So both in the interests of time and practicality, because we can use Bootstrap for a lot. I'm not going to try and cram a lesson in, but just give an overview of what it is. It's a new display property. So instead of display block or inline block, we can do display flex. And then we can use all these cool Flexbox rules sort of inside a containing parent div. And it lets us do a whole bunch of layout stuff.
Are they used in concert with each other or independently?
Great question. I want to say independently. Let me double check that. Oh, and I apologize, folks. I didn't realize I didn't have my own video running. Yeah, so the short answer is that Google says you can use a Flexbox container inside a CSS grid container, which makes sense because grid, like the idea of a grid system for laying stuff out has been around for a long time. And Bootstrap implemented one ages ago without CSS grid or Flexbox. And that's like your high level layout tool, like a grid of graph paper. Flexbox, you can do a bunch of different things with. This is definitely linked to in the curriculum. This article on CSS tricks is like the guide that everybody reads to learn Flexbox. As far as I know, it's the best one out there. Essentially, it makes the task of putting these blocks in order and having them flow and controlling how much they shrink or grow a lot easier. And you can change direction for things to be horizontal or vertical. This is a really wonderful article. When you get a chance, you should definitely check it out. And there's just a lot of Flexbox rules. And you can see here, each of these orange blocks is, imagine it as a div, which can have a whole bunch of other stuff inside it. And now all of a sudden we can use these rules to control spacing, and it becomes dramatically easier, and we don't have to mess with width and height and position and float and things like that. And we can use Flexbox, and it's great. And Bootstrap, I'm pretty sure these days, is using Flexbox and probably CSS Grid under the hood as well. I haven't actually looked at the CSS tricks guide to Grid, but it is probably also quite good based on the other one. And here again, it's basically, again, like laying stuff out in the grid. But I think what we should do is we should look at using Bootstrap. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to rename the index file to old index.html. I can also do this, like I'm going to right click on styles and I'm just going to rename it and rename it to old styles.html. And now I'm going to make a new index.html and a new styles.html. And the reason I'm doing this is the live server, it looks for a file named index.html. So this way we can just create our Bootstrap grid fresh, but still have all this example code. And actually, let me commit so that if I accidentally delete a file, we've still got stuff. And let me open up the new index.html and quickly scaffold it out. Doc type HTML. We need an HTML element. We need a header for a head. We need a body.
Adam,
And yes.
I just got a question. Is there any way you can show, because I think it's pretty it's a pretty nice feature with VS Code. So when you're creating the initial document, the explanation tab will create all that for you.
Oh, that's awesome. I actually am not familiar with that. How do I
Yeah, just type the explanation and then hit tab. So backspace and explanation and tab.
Oh, that's great. Like that.
Like all the way though. So and it should create it. So delete all that and just type explanation and then tab. Yep.
That's awesome. Okay, that's using Emmet, huh? That is really cool. Yeah, I haven't used Emmet a lot. It's essentially an extension, and it's available for a lot of editors that lets you use keyboard shortcuts to generate HTML. Thank you. I really appreciate that because that is awesome. Can I then also with Emmet, like if I want to make a link? Okay, that's awesome. That is great. Yeah, thank you so much. That's a good call. So whenever you're in an HTML file, it looks like you can just start typing the name of the element you're interested in. And if you hit tab, Emmet will autocomplete, which is awesome. Thank you. Very cool. And let me throw a quick hello world in here. And start up live server again. We've got our hello world. So let's use some Bootstrap. And as with all frameworks, the best way to get started with Bootstrap is through their getting started guide. And can anyone tell me what a CDN is? I'm seeing this acronym here. What is a CDN?
Content delivery network.
Yeah, and what is a content delivery network?
It's a repository of data that you commonly want to grab stuff from, and it somehow must have an optimized, I think they have like bonded network adapters that make it retrieve data more quickly.
Yeah, and that's honestly where that hits like the limit of my knowledge as well, about like the guts of how CDNs are working faster. The essence of it is like a company that runs a CDN would have a whole bunch of servers in different locations around the country, all serving the same content. So it's just holding a bunch of stuff. But because it's in a lot of different locations, like rather than, we haven't really talked about regions, but like, you know, if I'm fetching a website and the web server, and I'm in Chicago and the web server's in New York, that's not very far. If the web server is in Alaska, then we get a bit more lag. If the web server is in Mongolia, we get a lot more lag. For most websites, this doesn't matter. For stuff that we want to grab really quickly, it matters more. So a CDN, they have servers all over the place. And Jim, you are totally right. There's a lot more to it than that. And mainly, I just wanted to give like a really sort of high level overview of the basic concept. And hopefully I have this right. I'm not sure why I keep getting this live reload error, to be honest, because I should have a head and a body tag. Let's make sure that the website still loads. And it does. And notice that the font has changed. And let's see what the font is, and let's see where that change came from. And it's coming from this file reboot SCSS. And this is Bootstrap. Bootstrap has loaded a ton of CSS here for us in this file bootstrap.min, which stands for minified or shrunken CSS, and then a bunch of JavaScript, and the two work together. And then, like if I do an unordered list, let's see how Bootstrap styles this, if at all. So this is right, we're getting some Bootstrap stylings, which is really nice. Now let's see how we use Bootstrap's grid. So it's the same concept of blocks. And they talk about containers, rows, and columns. And we've all seen a spreadsheet, and it's the same idea. Like we got rows and we got columns in the rows. And these days it's built with Flexbox, as they mentioned, and fully responsive. And in fact, I'm just going to copy and paste this example HTML Before doing that, I'll follow my own rule of making sure I understand what's going on. We see that there's a div with this class container, and this is all these classes, these CSS classes are defined by Bootstrap. The container holds the whole grid, and I'll demonstrate it in a second. And actually, I think demonstration will be the quickest way to break it down. And they break it down here too, but honestly, we're just going to go ahead and paste it in. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my changes. Let me make this, in fact, we don't really need the terminal at all right now. We don't need the hello world. We don't need the unordered list. We don't need the list item. Wonder, live reload is not possible without a header body tag. I should have a head and body tag. I'm so confused by that. But live server does seem to be working. And voila, rather than having to struggle, we now have a 3-column layout, which is amazing. And if we want to run with this, let's make another row. So the container holds the whole grid. There's only like one container per grid, but then we've got 2 rows. And in fact, let's have another row. That's going to be at the top. And let's put a column in that. And let's put like a header in that.
Everything inside of this div or the container div is part of Bootstrap, everything.
So the way to think about it is Bootstrap is this really big CSS file that we've linked to and that the browser has loaded when we loaded this page. Bootstrap is this really big JavaScript file that the browser has loaded when we've loaded this page. And that includes a ton of CSS classes and JavaScript functions. And then when we are writing our HTML and CSS, we are using those Bootstrap CSS classes. And it's all designed to be like one system, which is why you do sort of have to like read the docs. Yeah, does that help a bit? Does that make sense? Sort of, maybe, not really.
Oh, yeah, it does, Adam.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and now like we can be very, like I can be very lazy. I've now centered that page title by, I have a row with 3 columns and I just put 2 empty ones there, and the Bootstrap CSS grid CSS classes take care of all that work of figuring stuff out. This design is responsive by default because again, a whole team of people have done a lot of work to make Bootstrap great. And our lives are dramatically simpler when it comes to doing page layout and all sorts of things. And the SM here stands for small. And what you can do is, I believe this is applying like different breakpoints, and you can use different rules. So by using like combinations of column small or column medium, you can set up different layouts depending on the screen size. And before I stick my foot in my mouth, we should see if we can take a quick look at that and see, yeah, equal width. Yep, and in fact, if you just use the column class without small, medium, or large, Bootstrap will use Flexbox to make stuff be basically as big as possible in that row. And we can probably, let's see here. That should be a double quote. Then there's, let's see, Bootstrap, grid, center, content. Bootstrap is going to have a great way to center content. It looks like they're doing it the same way that I was actually. They're just making 3 columns and putting one in the center, which is a pretty easy way to think about it. And honestly, just going through the tutorial here is going to be one of the best ways to do things. And so I'm going to go back to what I was doing before of class equals row. And we'll center our page title just by having like 3 columns. Though it does look like I need to. Sorry about that, by having 3 columns. And you can even stick stuff, you can like nest rows within columns. Like I am just going to grab all this stuff and we are going to put it inside here. And now it's a little ridiculous looking, but to go back to the New York Times website, you can imagine, I think, how you can start breaking all this into rows and columns, and inside a row have more rows and columns and lay out all sorts of interesting stuff. So let me pause and check in here and see what people's thoughts are, because I know I did just like jump through a lot of different things and throw a lot of HTML out there. How are people feeling and what do people think about Bootstrap?
It's great. I'm ready to get my hands dirty with it, start working with it.
Awesome. Yeah, how is everyone else feeling? What's on people's minds? Cool. I'm gonna kind of infer same thing. Grid layout is easy to visualize, looks good. Yeah, totally. It's awesome. Jim, you make a very good point. There are several other CSS frameworks in addition to Bootstrap. Bulma, I want to say named after a Dragon Ball Z character, is one of them, and is quite popular. Bootstrap in particular, we teach because it's been around a long time. It's been around a long time, and it's a great foundation. Like there are advantages to other frameworks, but like Bootstrap is a great foundation and starting point.
I thought that Bulma was a subset or a derivative of Bootstrap. It strikes me there's Bootstrap, and then what is SAAS or SASS?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what Bootstrap is, so Bulma is like, it's the same concept as Bootstrap. It's a bunch of CSS classes, and I don't know if they have JavaScript, but designed to work together. And just the same way that we use this link tag to have our browser page load the CSS file with all the Bootstrap, which actually, let me point that out. That's actually a great thing to see. So we saw the network tab a couple days ago. Let's watch again what happens when we refresh this page. My HTML page, my styles. We make a request to this CDN server, wherever it lives. And it sends back a massive, absolutely massive CSS file. Fonts, settings, font families, colors. You can set color themes. There are tons of interactive components with Bootstrap. There's a ton of stuff and a ton of JavaScript. And then that's what we get to use. And with Bulma, it's the same thing, but it's just a different framework written by a different team. I don't know why they don't have the CDN link here. They have their own version of the grid. It's lighter weight than Bootstrap. It doesn't do as much stuff, but can be a little if you kind of want to make more custom changes, maybe it's a bit easier. I'm not exactly sure what the differences are, to be honest. For us right now, it's not
There's
critical.
definitely a CDN link for it somewhere in there. I've used it before.
Yeah, there's gotta be. They probably just want to be fancy and just have the NPM installing be the main one. And then that was a great question about SCSS. Let's see if they actually have a description of what it is. So yeah, here's a good example. Basically, pretty early on, people figured out it'd be nice to have some variables with CSS. And so they created SCSS or SAS. And honestly, I'm not sure what SCSS stands for. I guess SAS stands for syntactically awesome style sheet. SCSS stands for sassy cascading style sheet. So there's not a ton of information in there, but essentially it's like brings in some more advanced features to CSS that make it feel a little more like a programming language, such as variables, like here and here and here. So instead of a .css file, you would have a .scss file, and you could use these variables, and then you would have to run that .scss file through a program that would generate the .css file that actually goes to the browser. Like the browser only understands CSS, so it's kind of like compiling. Like we need to transform this SCSS to CSS at the end of the day. And yes, sir, I think you had a question.
Yes, I'm still trying to figure out what is Bootstrap. So we're basically reading the documentation of Bootstrap and see which class we want to use and apply it in our HTML file. That's what we're doing.
Yes, exactly. Like
That's not,
what, sorry?
does that don't consume time to do that instead of us writing our class by ourselves?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Like, and actually on that note, let me talk quickly about the assignments, because that's a good question. And I think talking about that will help with that too. 3 day 5. So, you know, on Friday, we kind of combined Friday's lesson and today's lesson. Friday's assignment was to not use Bootstrap and essentially create a LinkedIn profile page using the display and position CSS properties, which is a very valuable exercise to do because it does make life a lot easier to have a solid understanding of how to work with those. As we've seen though, CSS Flexbox and Grid, and then frameworks like Bootstrap, which use Flexbox and Grid, do so much of that work for us. And today's assignment, and actually I will say this assignment I do recommend everyone take some time today, read the Flexbox guide, do this cool Flexbox Froggy game after you read the guide, because you don't want Bootstrap to be complete magic. And in your career, there will be many times if you're doing front-end work where you won't be using Bootstrap or Bulma, and your team will have essentially written your own sort of CSS framework. Or even if you are using Bootstrap, you'll need to do something more complicated, and you need to know how this stuff works. The assignment for today is basically to get to know Bootstrap. And this is a tutorial that walks through building a homepage and uses some of the very nice Bootstrap components. And we haven't even seen components that much. But for example, I should talk briefly about the nav class and the section class, and I think I will. But what we see here is this is basically HTML, right? We see divs, we see unordered lists, we see forms, all this HTML forms this really beautiful nav bar here. And the way all that is working is because all of these classes that we are using are bootstrapped classes, and they're all designed to work together. And you can kind of see like this creates the nav bar. This is something having to do with size. This one has to do with the color of the nav bar. So you kind of can combine the classes together, and you absolutely should use the bootstrap documentation, which as you can see is excellent as a guide. And like another good example is maybe about a card. Like if you want to create this using Bootstrap, here is the HTML to do so, and the examples of what Bootstrap CSS classes you should use. So this is a great starting point. You don't want to try and look at the actual Bootstrap CSS files. As you saw, those can get extremely complex, and they're very like modularized with SCSS and with some other pretty powerful pre-processing tools. It is going to be the documentation and building something and then using dev tools to interact with it and poke around, where you will kind of get to see how things work. And like here is a great example of how Bootstrap uses JavaScript. There is a JavaScript function that is like listening for a click event on a button with this claps property, but we don't have to worry about that. We just have to use the right CSS classes, and we can get this nice interactive behavior. Forms are pretty amazing. Without going into too much detail, there's a lot that you can do with forms and form controls. They have some very nice drop-down components as well, again, where things are well styled. What's another good one? They have a modal. Their modal is great. We can build our own modal, but oh, you don't really see the modal pop up here. Pagination is a good one. Like each of these is a link, and it's just an unordered list, but it's set up very nicely as like paging. It's quite powerful. Let's see here. Pop-ups. That's a good one. Again, here's the code that you would use. So what we're starting to see, and we're going to see this with Django too, is that the framework itself is so powerful and complex that just learning to use that is a task. Like the analogy I would use is like, we've learned how to use Python. We've seen a bit of HTML and CSS, and like we can use our tools to build other tools. And luckily a bunch of people have done this already and gone ahead and built like a jackhammer and a bulldozer for us. But you can't just go off and use a jackhammer or a bulldozer. I mean, you sort of can, but like you'll hurt yourself. Or like a really big crane, like you have to learn how to operate it. Like, so to go back to your question, Yaz, yeah, like once you start, and this is what most of programming is, working with libraries and frameworks that other people wrote. So that like today's assignment is really doing a Bootstrap tutorial and getting to know the Bootstrap framework. And that's probably a good point to pause, and we can break for lunch and stuff, but I want to check in and see if that makes sense and what people think. Sound good? Awesome. And the last thing I will very quickly show you is we didn't talk too much about like, there's a nav section element. There's HTML elements named section. They don't behave very differently than divs. They're there really for semantic reasons. They don't change that much how stuff renders on the page. So you might see them in Bootstrap, but don't worry about it too much. You can kind of read more about it here, but it's more about like search engine optimization and the way that like Google bots crawl web pages and stuff like that. So it's less relevant for us right now. Let me go ahead and stop sharing and stop recording.